You know, you get so fed up of some of these really important issues that we're not actually able to discuss because they're immediately weaponised by Westminster, the Tories, and it becomes just dog whistle politics, doesn't it?
It does, yes, it does.
Yeah.
There's a few examples of those, isn't there?
There is.
Anyway, we're about to be talking about one of them, aren't we, in this this month's episode? But ferries.
But ferries.
But ferries. It's you definitely need the tone of voice. It's become a kind of meme for everything that's wrong with Scotland, but ferries. Anyway, we think that with the discussion that we have in this programme, we can do something to dispel the kind of, divisiveness, wedge issue kind of politicking that goes on around it, and actually talk to a few people who know a lot about ferries and also know what it's like to be living somewhere where you're dependent on ferries.
Well, we've got several guests today. We've got two from Yes Orkney, Geordie Sandison and Mike Robertson, and we're very pleased that they were able to join us. And we also have another guest that we've had on the show before. Always delighted to see Professor Alf Baird.
So he's a former professor of maritime business at Edinburgh Napier University. And as it happens, he also lives in Orkney. You want to go down to Kirkwall. I mean, what's the choice like? I mean, how reliable is it? You know, what's it actually like?
There's a problem in as much as we spend 2.5 months this time of year on what they call the refit timetable, which means we've only got 2 ships instead of 3. So obviously the service is quite a bit reduced. But the winter service is reduced because, they have extra sailings in the summertime for mainly the tourist trade, I suppose, because they need extra sailings for extra capacity. Because the ships are probably too small. They're 30 years old. The thinking that went into them will be older than that. I've no idea when they start planning these things, but this is the outer North Isles. Even in the North Isles, we've got the islands that are further away, and the 4 islands served by 2 ferries that are quite close to the mainland. The mainland as in Orkney mainland. And then in the rest of the North Isles, we've got 4 bigger islands that are served by these 3 ferries, but we've also got 2 smaller islands. One right north and one right northwest that have a much reduced service. North Ronaldsay, for example, it's lucky if it gets one boat per week.
Wow.
Extremely lucky in the summertime. They do have slightly enhanced air service provided by Islander planes.
That's interesting you mentioned North Ronaldsay, because the one time I was up being on Orkney, which last June, it was just spectacularly sun and blue skies the whole time we were there. And myself and my friend I was up with, we had this fantastic day out by catching the ferry at Kirkwall mid-morning, which then steamed all the way up to North Ronaldsay. We're just, sitting on the outside of the boat, kind of looking around going, God, it's so beautiful, isn't it? And the captains say, if I see any whales, I'll let you all know. And it was just brilliant. But then we get to North Ronaldsay, and there was a few vehicles had to get taken off onto the island, and then some that were going back on the boat. And it's all done with a derrick and being hoisted out of the boat and onto the... Yeah. And I'm going, oh, God, they don't just roll off and roll on then. So... from the point of view of a tourist, it was fantastic. But from the point of view of living there, I thought, not so good. So, Mike, you're on Orkney mainland. What's your kind of feeling about how things stand at the moment?
Well, I think the thing that surprised me, I came back here, having lived in Shetland for about 30 years. I came back here actually about almost 20 years ago. It was the days of the Arcadia, which was twice a week. Everything was pulled on and off when I left. And when I came back, there were these new boats, and I thought, it was amazing that they've got all these wonderful new boats doing this link, but how on earth did they get past the equalities people and the disability rules and everything? Because here was a disabled toilet up a flight of steps. Yeah. This is, and to get to it, you've got to climb over a scuttle. My father, in his latter years, he wasn't too mobile. And when he came into town, they had to get a special dispensation for him to sit in the car for the course of the journey. And it was purely because the boats just weren't up to the standard that everybody else was expecting.
What you were saying before, access and toilets, they've got a problem, you see, because they've got these other islands to serve, like North Ronaldsay and Pappy. They have side doors on the vehicle deck.
That's right, yeah.
And the water can wash all the way across, and that's why it wouldn't have seemed like a good idea to have, say, a toilet, for example, on the car deck level, and that's why they're all up by two steps. It's because of the levels of the historical piers that they had to deal with when they first came into service. Because when they first came into service, they maybe were one link span operating, but the rest weren't. So when they first came to West Street, they were at the old pier, and I remember a small lorry, like a 6-wheeler, had to be lifted ashore in 2 parts. They'd lift the platform off, and then the chassis, engine, cab bit, and then reassemble them on the pier, because the crane wasn't big enough to lift the whole damn thing at one go. So everything at that time was still being lifted until the various link spans came into operation as they got completed. But the trouble with the link spans is they're the same age as the ferries. So they're mechanical. Yeah, a pier's a pier, they think, and it'll stand there forever. But actually, if you look closely at these piers, the metal is corroding at a fantastic rate, or has corroded. They now have better anodes on it, I believe, so they might last for another 20 years. But at some stage, they're going to have to redo all the sides of them, like repile them. And the link spans are mechanical structures, so they're also 30 years old. Okay, they've probably replaced rams and stuff, but at some stage they'll have to be replaced as well.
But my experience really with them mostly has been visiting my parents in Sandy, which, well, they both died a few years ago now, so I haven't been doing that lately. And that was a journey from Kirkwall out to Sandy. We'd go out in the morning and come back in the evening. Hopefully the boat was running. But more recently, I've noticed there are far more breakdowns. They are saying that the boats now are well beyond their use-by date. They can't get spares anymore, and quite often they have to get spares manufactured specially to repair engines which break down regularly and so on. But as somebody I know who has campaigned quite a lot for getting some improved ferries and has hit a brick wall with the council, because I think there's it's almost a point of principle that they've got, where at some time in the past they were promised by the Scottish Government that they would fully fund the ferries, but this has never materialised, and there is a reserve fund in Orkney which tends to make people think, well, you've got money, why should you have any more? And so this money is not to be used for ferries, but to be used for other rainy day projects.
So that's a reserve fund that came from Orkney folk negotiating with the oil companies, is that right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and it's had to be used to support general operations for quite some time, I think. There is a reluctance of the OIC to spend on ferries, and I think as a naive viewer from the outside, it seems to me a little unfair that the people in the North Isles have to suffer for a point of principle in the OIC, but perhaps I'm looking at it too simply.
There's not really a lot we can do with the external ferries except moan. Well, there's not much we can do with any of them except moan, because the main problem is where the money comes from. And so long as that is tied up at Westminster, I hate to say it, we're probably wasting our time. We can blame the shipping company. We can blame their immediate superiors, Orkney Islands Council. We can blame the Holyrood government, but none of them provide the money. And until independence, I can't see us being able to do a lot. I don't know how we get the money out of them, because there's nowhere else for it to come from, because everything is so, where we spent the last 10 years with austerity and then all the other calamities. So, you know, if Liam Byrne was choking when he said there was no money in 2010, on the current system, there's definitely no money now.
There's definitely no money.
Nobody will admit that they can just make the stuff.
Yeah.
And ferries could be sorted.
Say the money was there. How would you spend it?
Yeah, we need newer ships. And we possibly need more of them. Maybe they don't have to be all the same.
And what Geordie said about the money is true, that there is a lot of money required to replace these ferries. You're certainly into 100 million or more. The council would have you believe it's over 400 million that's needed. That there are ways that this could be reduced, but these aren't being explored. Again, there is a fashion, if you like, a fad amongst both the Scottish Government and the OIC that catamarans are not suitable, whereas catamarans are being used throughout the world and offer a much cheaper service. They're cheaper to run. They can carry twice the number of vehicles at half the cost. And it doesn't require significant alterations to any of the piers because they're the same length as the existing boats. They're just wider, and the linkspan ramps, or rather the ramps on the boat itself, have to be adjusted to suit the existing linkspans, but that's not a major thing.
As a passenger, what's the difference being on the catamaran and being on the traditional ferry, the monohull?
The motion is different. A monohull rolls and keeps on rolling because you've got a pendulum effect. You don't get that with catamarans. They just lift with the surface of the sea. Well, okay, there's a small one hull go down slightly in the other one, but yeah.
It's spread over a wider area. Yeah.
Now we're going to have a look at the Holyrood Net Zero Committee, where Alf happens to have been one of the three experts on one of their evidence sessions. They asked more or less the same question as we've just asked the two Orkney folk. What do they think that people on the islands need?
There's been a lot of research on the needs of island groups around the world, and often top of the list is frequency, because frequency also gives you reliability of the system. Price tends to come down a bit lower. Frequency is the most important feature in most studies of user needs, and that gives reliability. And that can be achieved by faster speeds and also by more vessels per route, simpler vessels rather than opulent vessels that's been described for the CalMac type of ships. So I think that's important. On investment, I think there's been enormous investment in ferries in Scotland. That's not the problem. The problem is it's spent very badly. And partly that's very much related to the very poor procurement process. It's a very restrictive procurement process. The specification of the ship is very, very tight. Lots of bidders are squeezed out of that procurement process, including in the recent bidding for the two vessels, for the second two of the four for Isla, where only two bidders bid, but the second bidder was rejected for spurious reasons. The other feature I would add is that a lot of my research in the last 30 years has been on catamarans around the world, and we have catamarans in Orkney now. We're on the second ones. These have replaced CalMac monohulls that originally started the services in Orkney, and we've tried to get these ferries widely used within Scotland, and all of us were members of Keith Brown's expert ferry group, which has since disbanded, and I certainly advocated catamarans should be deployed, at least on trial periods, and we were able to offer ministers and officials and ferry agencies catamarans, but they always refused to buy them. Now, CalMac and CMAL have always refused to use catamarans. It so happens, I believe this week, they may well be chartering the Orkney ferry catamaran, the Pentalina. So after 15 years of rejecting catamarans, they might finally be using one, because they are desperate for tonnage, and ships are collapsing now. The issue with catamarans is they come in at 1/3 or between half and 1/3 the price of CalMac monohulls. They're half the time to build. They're much more efficient to run because of the lower displacement. I mean really the weight of the ship. The catamarans have half the power requirement of a monohull, so half the emissions. And if you're interested in net zero, the catamarans give you that. So half the price or less, half the emissions, and also the most stable safe ferry platform you can possibly get. And this is the result of Professor Vassalos' recent study at Strathclyde on these catamarans. Much more stable, no need for ballast tanks or stabilisers, gives you a good indication of that, and a massive saving on price. The problem is CMAL do not include them in the tender process.
What the island communities require is good connectivity. Alf put his finger on it. Frequent, reliable services, preferably run in a cost-effective manner that doesn't cost the Scottish taxpayer an arm and a leg as it currently is. Worth pointing out too that there are 10 year-round vehicle ferry operators operating in Scottish waters. Most of them provide a good, reliable and in many of them frequent service. Some of them are exemplars of good practice, and I would in that regard name especially Shetland Islands Council Internal Ferries, Pentland Ferries operating across the Pentland Firth, and Western Ferries on the Clyde.
We're all going to be experts on catamarans by the end of this programme, and here's a little presentation that Alf did to give us some of the basics.
So there's two different sizes, mainly about 35 metre 16-car capacity and 50 metre, the bigger vessels handling about 28 cars. If we compare these with catamarans, we can see that the smaller vessel, the 35 metre length vessel, can carry about 30 cars. That's about twice the capacity, and the same with the catamaran on the bigger length. 50 metre length of the catamaran is a capacity of 50 cars. So the catamarans carry twice as many cars as the monohull for the same length of ship. The reason for this is quite simply that the monohull has a much narrower deck and much wider side casings as well, which take up a lot more capacity and give extra weight on the vessel. So you can see here the slides showing quite a narrow deck on the monohulls, and that's the explanation, the main explanation why they don't carry many cars. Whereas the catamaran, with a much wider platform on two hulls, carries 6 or 7 vehicles wide and twice the capacity. That's the 50-metre vessel here and the 35-metre catamaran here, which has a similar kind of beam and similar kind of deck capacity. If we look at a summary of the two options here, on the top is the monohulls, on the bottom of the table is the catamarans. The top shows that the average age at the current fleet is about 31 years, average speed 12 knots. A move towards similar length catamarans would almost double the car capacity to 240, would increase the passenger capacity by 30% to over 1,000, and would also increase the speed from 12 to about 14 knots. So there's a big environmental advantage to move towards catamarans. If we look at costs, here on the left-hand side is the monohulls, on the right-hand side is the catamarans. If we were replacing 6 vessels, 3 35-metre monohulls and 3 50-metre monohulls, for a like-for-like replacement, the cost of the monohulls would be about £108 million. That's a car capacity of about 132 cars, so it's a cost per car space of almost £1 million. The catamarans, if we were replacing the fleet with catamarans, 3 35-metre vessels and 3 50-metre boats, the catamarans are considerably cheaper than the monohulls, about half the price, £60 million for the 6 vessels. And this is a price obtained from a catamaran designer and builder in Asia. These vessels would provide almost twice as many car spaces, 240 in total, and that gives you a capital cost per car space on the ships of £250,000. So it's about a third of what the monohulls are per car space. So a big benefit in terms of capital cost as well as carrying capacity. Whatever vessels decided, monohulls or catamarans, a range of tailored designs for ramps can be introduced for these using the existing infrastructure to best effect as well. Catamarans have also been designed for high sea state operations with higher bow, higher tunnel arrangements, and also visor arrangements to stop water flowing in. So catamarans can be built and have been built for these kind of sea conditions, including the outer isles operations. As we can see from the experience of Pentalina, which is a 60-metre vessel, and the Alfred, the new one, 98-metre. Just a couple of points here on reliability. It's often been said in the past, particularly by those advocating monohulls, that there's a question about the reliability of catamarans. But I think the Orkney experience with Pentland Ferries has proved beyond doubt that the catamaran can hold its own in the roughest sea conditions of the Pentland Firth. On several days during the storms, Ciara and Dennis, when Pentland Ferries Alfred sailed, but the larger monohull did not sail. Research on this, which I've been involved in the past, has shown that the monohull suffers largely because of higher windage, higher deck area, so it suffers from the windage problem. The catamaran has a benefit in having 4 engines and 4 propellers, so is able to turn in a much more confined harbour area as well. So it tends to be a more reliable option. The issue isn't sailing at sea that's necessarily the problem, it's berthing in port. And the catamaran is more than able to hold its own in berthing in any conditions the monohull has to contend with.
I don't know if it was because he was in Orkney, but at any rate, his screen was sort of freezing every now and again. So you'll notice that. The sound is fine, sounds absolutely fine, but his screen does freezes a little bit. So sorry about that, but we still want to let you hear what he had to say.
That seems to be quite a compelling case for catamarans. We know that last week you were actually at the Holyrood Select Committee. Do you think there's any chance that they are listening?
Yeah, I think they are. Keith Brown, about a decade ago, set up the Expert Ferry Group so that we could try to get some sense into ferries policy amongst the officials and the agencies that deliver ferry policy and procurement, so that ministers didn't have to apologise continually in the Parliament for the mistakes that were being made. But this goes back to the 90s as well. We've had these horrendous mistakes. It all comes in from the initial specification that CalMac and CMAL seem to have, which ends up with a prototype monohull of their own design and specification. It's a kind of prescribed process, which is totally different from many other ferry services globally that I've been involved in studying and researching and presenting on. I think it's a cultural problem that we face. It's an embedded, almost a kind of arrogance. We designed this vessel and that's it. And that's all you're getting, islanders. and you can take it or leave it.
What's the kind of size of the ferry fleet in Scotland? I mean, were we talking hundreds or?
Well, it's actually very underdeveloped. We have around 100 ferries between the Western Isles and the Northern Isles. The Western Isles, there's 30 on CalMac, but there's also private operators like Western Ferries. There's a couple of ferries for Argyll and Bute, and then in Orkney and Shetland ferries, there's internal ferries, there's about 20 ferries there, and then you've got the Northlink bundle that runs from Aberdeen up to Orkney and Shetland. So there's not, then you've got things like the Corran ferry, the Cromarty ferry, so there's little ferries. We actually have an underdeveloped system. We have about less than 100 ferries. Norway has well over 300, probably 400 now. What we have is an underdeveloped system. I would say we probably need double the ferries that we have, because we're not able to provide the required frequency for island communities that they need. Frequency is the key driver of demand and economic growth on the islands, and for that you need more vessels, a more frequent service, a bit like treating it like a bus or a train service. And that's how the Norwegians run it. And the fact they have their tender process enables innovative, integrated trans-European operators to transport companies to bid, like Veolia and even Stagecoach and others can bid for these kind of services, because these companies are running buses, trains and ferries, and they can integrate the whole thing. Whereas the Scottish Government has maintained this monopoly position that it has to be CalMac's fleet, CMAL provide the fleet, and really the private integrated operators never bid for this service. The only company that bids to operate CalMac or Northlink is Serco, and because they operate state-owned assets. Whether it's a ferry or a prison or whatever, they operate. That's what they do. They're not a transport provider. They're certainly not an integrated transport provider. So what we could have had is the pan-European transport integrated groups coming in and bidding. And what they do is they provide the vessels, just like they provide buses and maybe trains as well in some markets. They provide the ferries and they invest in them. In a sense, we don't really need government to do all this. Government doesn't need to buy ferries. It's not very good at doing it. Its cost overruns are enormous, and its efficiency on the ferries is always problematic, because that specification for the ferry comes from deep within the bowels of CalMac, and that really is within I suppose it's put together by senior shipping people within the RMT and Nautilus trade unions, and that's who develops it. I've likened it before, like for example, crews and ferries and everything do a great job and everything, but you don't necessarily ask them to design a ferry. Just like you don't ask a train driver to design a train, or a pilot to design an aircraft, or a bus driver to design a bus. It requires a multidisciplinary approach to look at economies of scale, efficiency, global knowledge about how ferries can provide the best service, and so on. So what you have in this system in Scotland is basically the people that work on the boat developing the spec as how they see fit, and which isn't necessarily in the user's interest. It's more in the suppliers, the provider's interest.
That was quite an interesting point that came up, I think, during your Holyrood visit. Why would you want full catering on a boat that's going a journey of an hour when you can sit on a train up to, I think Inverness was the example given, for over 3 hours and you're not going to even get a cup of coffee?
I didn't think that was a terribly good comparison, since actually whenever I've sat on a train up to Inverness, I've been dying for a cup of coffee actually. But I mean, my experience of using the ferries over in the Western Isles, and last year I was in Orkney and Shetland for a holiday, so I'm experiencing them as a holiday maker, and from that point of view, I think they're brilliant. I mean, I know of course I know they break down, so that's not so good, and then it's a gale or something, and they get cancelled. But there was one year I got myself to Baird, to Castle Bay, and then had a day when I started off at 9 o'clock in the morning. Of course, I've got a bus pass. The bus up to the first ferry, and then a ferry over. And the ferries and the buses are all there's a bus waiting once you get over to Eriskay, and then that takes you a bit further up, and everyone's chatting away, so it's all very kind of pleasant. And I mean, by 5 o'clock, I was getting picked up by a friend in Stornoway, having had a completely uninterrupted, gorgeous day.
When you're a tourist, though, it's a different mindset, it's a different experience, and it's a different world. If you're commuting and you're relying on it to get home that night, I think they're very different.
Over in the Western Isles, there's really only, all the main ferries are coming in over the Inch. So it's a bigger ferry, it's a bigger boat. The two small ones are the ones that go from Barra up to Eriskay, and then from over the Sound of Harris over to... And you're right, of course, it's completely different if you're just there as a holiday maker, and you don't even mind if it's late,
We don't have enough ferries. We don't have really very efficient ferries. The system is underdeveloped, so the frequency is quite poor. There needs to be probably a completely new look at the whole of Scottish ferry sector. And the problem we have is the Transport Scotland provides this long-term ferries plan that puts in place an idea that ferries will be replaced at a given time, but they never are met. These objectives are never met. They're just aspirations. And it's part of the problem is they're specifying ferries that are too expensive, too big, too heavy, and too fuel consuming and too labour intensive as well. So it means they can only buy a few. They can't buy enough. And Norway's replaced, I think, about 200 ferries in the last 20 odd years. And we're struggling to replace a handful.
Yeah. And if they replace them with catamarans, would that make a big difference to her?
Well, they have a specific design of fjord ferry that's slightly different from Scotland, because most of the fjords are relatively enclosed. They have a low wave height, and they support them with what they call high-speed catamarans. That's small passenger vessels that go quite high speed. So every fjord really has that kind of network. What I've advocated is a move towards catamarans, as we've operated here in Orkney now for more, getting on for 15 years or more. We're on to the second catamaran at Pentland Ferries, and these were purchased at about a third the price of a CalMac ship. So for one of these, for one CalMac ship, you can get 3 catamarans, and they've operated really well during the winter. They're designed for high sea states in Scotland. They're designed by a Scotsman in Brisbane that's built I think probably about 100 of these medium speed catamarans for services around the world. He's got his catamarans all over the world: the Caribbean, in the Netherlands, Middle East, Asia, different places, even in Africa, and now in Scotland. And he's tried for many, many years to get CalMac to take them, but it's just a cultural barrier. CalMac have this cultural barrier. They specify their own monohulls. the problem is, the issue as I put into my presentation on the Orkney replacement programme, is that the catamaran is wider than a monohull. It takes twice as many cars for a given metres in length. It has a shallower draft and a shorter length, so therefore it can fit a lot of the existing piers no problem without big modernisation. You see, the problem with CalMac and CMAL's development plan is they want bigger monohulls, and every time they do that, they cost an enormous amount of extra in port infrastructure. For the new vessels that were supposed to go on Arran service, they had to rebuild practically Brodick and Ardrossan. Now there's over £100 million put the two together. Then you've got the Uig Triangle, Uig, Lochmaddy, Tarbert, three ports, probably another £100 million. These are enormous sums in ports that you don't really need. So, as I say, the catamaran has a draft, that's a depth under the water, which is 1/3 less than the monohull. So can access most of the piers. And the pier modifications are much, much less expensive. One of the big advantages of the catamaran is that you can carry twice the volume of cars in a given length, but for the same power as the monohull, which carries half. So you have a tremendous advantage on lower emissions, lower costs, and these things operate really reliably, like we have proved in Orkney. The great news this week, actually, is that the Pentland Ferries second vessel, which was replaced by the bigger Alfred, carrying 100 cars, Pentolina carries about 75, about the same as Finlagan that goes to Isla. And Pentolina has been, I think it's been chartered by CalMac. She was in Greenock Dry Dock this week, and I think that was for her MCA survey and maybe some finishing off work. And I think she will be operational in the CalMac network within a few days.
Maybe having one that works, that disproves all their fears, is all you need to open the door.
Yeah, well, the Pentolina it did berthing trials in Arran, Isla, Mull, Oban a couple of years ago, but I think the RMT got involved and gave the operators some bad publicity, calling them, pirates and buccaneers and all the rest of it. Just because Pentland Ferries don't have a strong union connection. They're a private company that likes to do its own thing. But that's not the same issue as the ship's suitability. Working practices, I think, have to be a separate issue. Scottish budgets aren't limitless. We're spending billions on ferries. CalMac, when it was started, was supposed to be almost profit making back in the 1970s and 80s, but now almost 80% of its income is from subsidy.
Public service. Go and explain a little bit for me. There's a ferry cycle, and you said that they buy them at the most expensive point in the cycle. How does that cycle work?
Well, it's the shipbuilding cycle, which is well known in shipping and maritime economics. Is shipbuilding cycle is the global shipbuilding market increases with demand, obviously, and then it reaches a peak and then it falls, usually through some shock or some other event or some other aspects, but it usually falls quite dramatically. So the astute ship owner will always try to avoid buying his ships at the peak. What happens with the Scottish government is it recently allocated its £580 million budget for ferries and ports, and off CMAL wandered into the global ferry market just at the peak. 2023, this year, the expectation, because of the global recession, because of other global events, shipyards will gradually become a little bit quieter, probably quite a bit quieter. We've passed the peak in other sectors. You see container shipping, cruise shipping, other aspects which keep shipyards busy. So all these aspects, tankers, bulk carriers, all these markets are falling a bit. So shipyard capacity will increase in the next year or two, and that's really the time to buy is probably later this year, or maybe even in the next quarter. In fact.
What is the relationship like? Well, business relationship, financial relationship between ScotGov and the Orkney Council, because the internal ferries up in Orkney, they're run by the council, aren't they? And
yes, well, it's a company, but it's owned by the council, connected to the Harbours Department. The Port Authority in Orkney is part of the council, as it is in Shetland. So they have a lot of skills and expertise in maritime transport. And I think this is what we discussed the last time, is on ports, they've been able to gather some of the income from the oil transport and the taxes levied on tankers, if you like, whereas on the Forth and Clyde, the private port operators have extracted all that revenue, whereas Orkney and Shetland have been able to build up their wealth funds from the oil sector, mainly through taxes levied on tankers. But it's pretty much an accident of history. They own and operate the ferries within the island group. It's never been run by central government. It's never been run by a CalMac type of entity. So that's what's done here. So therefore it leaves a challenge for the council to invest in that fleet. And the fleet here is perhaps even more aged than CalMac's fleet.
Yeah.
It really is.
I noticed that actually when it was
really
on it.
does need replaced pretty badly.
Is that the kind of thing that the Scottish Investment Bank could do? Because
the Scottish Investment Bank is very limited. It should be doing that, but it has limited funds in the Scottish Investment Bank, and seems to be geared towards other kind of quaint investment projects with people that are well connected, if you know what I mean. But it's not really geared towards public sector necessarily, as a Scottish National Investment Bank should be.
Yeah.
The funding issue is important here because I think the revenue from internal ferries might be about, say, 12 to 14 million, but the revenue is only about 2 or 3 or 4 million. So there's a funding gap of about 10 million a year. And that's just for operating. It's not for replacing the fleet. So there's a constant operating gap, which Orkney Council gets some funding from central government, I think about 7 million, and then they have to take money from their own internal funds to support the rest. But the problem is the capital for replacing the fleet. All I can say is that, the council go back and forward to Edinburgh quite often trying to get John Swinney or whoever, or Kate Forbes to agree to help fund, or to fund entirely the fleet replacement. And they've estimated that at about 400 million. 200 million on about 10 ships and 200 million on port infrastructure. Now that's an enormous sum.
Yeah.
My estimates before for catamarans would be half the figure. Half the figures would be catamarans, and you could replace the entire fleet, and they would operate more efficiently as well and provide a lot more capacity. So that's what my presentation was about, showing that catamarans like the Pentalina, like the Alfred that Pentland Ferries have, on smaller levels, proven boats, could reduce the cost of investment in new ships by half, and also provide an increase in capacity, about 50% on car capacity. And that's what really is a big constraint on the development of all the little islands in Orkney. And Shetland as well. If we were to look at funding, this is just an indicative idea of funding with relatively high interest rate. On the top is the catamarans this time, the bottom is the monohulls. So the loan, 100% loan of £60 million for the catamarans taken over 25 years would result in an annual repayment of £3.8 million. The similar loan for replacement of monohulls would be about £7 million, so almost double the capital cost based on a 25-year loan, which government has been able to do for CalMac. If we were looking at a ship lease from the builders and the operators, a ship lease over 15 years, again, fairly high interest rate here, just as an idea. The annual repayment for the monohulls at 108 million cost would be about £9.6 million per annum, whereas the catamarans would be about half this at £5 million per annum. So all in all, the catamarans can be obtained for much less than the monohulls. This just gives some idea of what the options are for funding. Obviously, a great option for Orkney would be 100% Scottish Government funding if it was available. The other option here is 100% Orkney Islands Council funding. There is also the possibility here of joint funding between both. There is a combination of a possibility of grants and loans, which might reduce the annual figure down quite a lot. There's also possibility of a contribution from the OIC Oil Wealth Fund. We also have in Scotland the new Scottish National Investment Bank, which is tasked with making investments in this kind of infrastructure. And a final option is always, where public services are tendered anyway, is for a private operator to come in and operate the service. But the services within Orkney, there's no plan to tender them.
And the way it works in Norway is small bundles. There are 4 or so large ferry operators who bid for these bundles. So a bundle will be a single route or a group of routes. And the operator brings their own ship to the show. The Norwegian government doesn't take anything to do with building ships, building or designing ferries. It's the operators that provide their own ferries. There is a mantra within I guess the Scottish Government of no debundling. That's a mistake. I think the future has to be small bundles, and there's one community, namely Mull and Iona, who are interested in the possibility of taking over their ferry service as a community venture, which fits in exactly with the Scottish Government's Islands Act, empowering local communities, just absolutely spot on in that regard. Yet, as things stand at the moment, there seems to be great resistance to that possibility. Now, if it caught on in Mull, it could catch on in other places. I think Arran might be another contender for that, and I guess at some other places.
You said in the Caledonian Inquirer just in December that, quote, if you tendered and debundled, you would get the private sector coming in and operating services in corridors and different routes, but still regulated by a transport authority as they do in Norway. Now, the other side of this, I've heard concerns that what people who call for this are really calling for is for companies like Serco and P&O, who are not as generous with wages and conditions, to come in and bid for profitable lifeline routes. Is that what you would like to see?
What has to happen is the integrated transport providers across Europe are not the Sercos necessarily, or the P&Os even, of this world. Companies like Veolia and others that were interested in bidding for Scottish routes on a debundling basis, and Stagecoach as well, to some extent, are integrated transport providers who operated bus, trains and ferries. So they just look at them as a transport vehicle. And that's what we have to look on ferries, as just another bus, another train, rather than something unique that has to be managed separately. And having it as part of an integrated transport thing can be done. But like I say, you could still have a central government run operation as long as it's run efficiently.
You'll be aware that Orkney is very keen on renewables and very concerned about climate change and so on. So it's not just a matter of getting a new ferry. We also want ferries that are ideally net zero and run on either battery or hydrogen or something of that kind that doesn't cause any pollution. And that adds another layer to the challenges that are involved. Although, from what I can gather, if you choose the right sort of powertrain, then you can sort of hedge your bets, as it were. So even if you have to start off with something that isn't quite an ideal completely net zero, you will in the future be able to replace it with something that is. So hopefully that will come about as a result of this task force in Edinburgh too.
So there's always going to be a limit for a persuasion point of view. Persuading the main population of Scotland that the islands are worth spending that amount of money on. But if the taxpayer, the magic taxpayer, doesn't have to pay the damn bill, we can remove that for the equation. So there's enough ferries required in Orkney to keep 2 or 3 shipyards operating full stop, full time, all the time, forever.
And that's there's employment that goes with that. There's all sorts of investment.
At least 2 shipyards, I would say, out of the size, because we've only got one operating shipyard, and they have a kind of shipyard at Rosyth, but it's an assembly yard as opposed to a shipyard.
Yeah.
They've got a big dry dock, and you can have a big dot of concrete, and you just put modules together, and then you float them off, which is probably okay. So we've got the capacity there. You then just need to take in the technology and the people to make it work. I think the government needs to own that yard, or whatever other yard we're talking about.
I think you made a good point. Orkney's needs for ferries going into the future could keep, might be a smallish shipbuilding yard going, but could basically keep it going into the future.
I was meaning the whole Scottish ferries fleet.
All right, okay. What struck me when you said that was, and then you'd also sort of said, well, if you could persuade the rest of Scotland, the Orkney and the Western Isles that need all these ferries. But actually, if that shipbuilding yard is in, say it's on the Clyde, or it might be over at Ross Ice on the Ford, that's a good argument, isn't it? It's kind of like, here you go.
Yeah.
There's jobs there's apprenticeship, there's good jobs, there's decent wages, it'll feed into the local economy, and it'll keep all you guys going with decent boats.
Do you know what I'd like them to do? This, I think you could be a little bit more imaginative when it comes to, like, take the Scotwind auction. If one of the conditions of being part of that was, and we want you to adopt a ferry, or we want you to provide the equivalent of a ferry as part of the contract, you could kind of tie it onto something else.
It's probably not going to happen this side of independence, because you have to fight it through Westminster to get that.
Another aspect that would come with independence, one of the mainstays for that, from my point of view, is the well-being economy. And what that says is it's not just about saying this is cost effective. It's about saying, is this a good idea for the people that live in that area? So this would apply to lifeline services such as these ferries, and making sure that people who live in remote regions have the proper infrastructure that they can get employment and live a reasonable life.
But we also want new ferries to be as sustainable and zero carbon if possible, but as low carbon as they can be. So, I came across a wee, it was just a wee video about, it's an electric ferry that runs in Denmark between some of their islands, and it can do, I think it can do a 90-kilometre round trip on one charge. And it looks like, you kind of read and you think, well, that would do for some of it. I don't know if it would do to get up to North Ronaldsay, but it would certainly do for a lot of the inner islands in Orkney. But
that was really interesting when we saw that. I think it was called the Ellen, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
And it was the first time, I think, that they had proved the technology of a battery-powered ferry able to run a regular service. And I think, as you say, the distances involved were certainly comparable with the distances the ferries into the North Isles do. Obviously, it's got to charge up, and you've got an awful lot of energy has got to go into the boat while it's being charged up. And one of the difficulties we have here is the poor grid. The grid's setup here is being improved. We've got a big new substation going in, and we are trying very hard to get a new interconnector between us and the mainland, which may be necessary in order to do this. But again, with the net zero view, that the cruise ships that come here, when we get hundreds of those a year, and that they could be obliged to take shore power when they're in, until somebody realised that the shore power to one of these vessels is probably more than the entire Orkney demand. So, you've got a problem with the infrastructure there. But we work on that too. And there's a great deal of work going on to review all these things and make the case to Ofgem that we should have better interconnections and that we should be capable of. It all gets tied up in a complete mix-up here, there, and everywhere. It's not just a matter of an interconnector that can deliver power to Orkney, but also in doing that, we would be able to put up more wind turbines, generate more electricity locally, and ship it south when it's required. Certainly, the grid would probably have to be improved in order to support battery-powered vessels.
And then on the other hand, you've got issues on the mainland with the grid not having the capacity for all the power that's in it. And really, your electric vehicles then become batteries that you can store power in overnight and help the grid. That's where you would be evening the power out so that you, because the peak demand, which happens around about tea time, then you want to try and reduce that demand and get people to use more at other times.
Fiona and I both run electric cars, and it could easily, the battery in our car could easily be fitted, except that there's infrastructure there to do it. Anyway, that's a whole other kind of topic.
And so for our final section, back to Alf in the studio, and we continue on that theme of just how good could the future be. So moving us from but ferries to but ferries.
The other aspect which I've proposed in working with the designer of the catamarans and also people on the Clyde and Inchgreen Dry Dock and so on is to develop shipbuilding capacity where we can build these vessels in Scotland.
Yes.
And we have a need for, in my view, we have a need for 100 ferries. We don't have, and this is for the Clyde, for the Western Isles, for Northern Orkney, Shetland, but also for the urban ferries I think we discussed before, for the Forth and the Clyde. We should have a Clyde River bus with a dozen little ferries going up and down from Central Station down to Erskine and beyond. We should have fast ferries on Gourock Dunoon, not these old clapped out things that Calmac bought or Seamal bought. We should have cross-Forth ferries running from Granton to Bird Island as used to run up until the 1950s, possibly also to Methil. And that's what Pentland Ferries was wanting to do some years ago and put 2 catamarans on that route. And that was blocked by the fact that Forth Ports that own the estuary, if you like, the private equity fund who Mrs. Thatcher and gave the ownership and regulation powers of the estuary, they wanted to tax every passenger Forth on the ferry. And that was at the same time as government was taking off bridge tolls at the Forth Bridge. So it left the ferry uncompetitive, plus Fife Council wouldn't put in place any park and ride facilities at Burnt Island for it. So it needed to be an integrated solution, and we estimated it could have easily carried 1 million passengers a year. Like many cities around the world have urban ferries, we don't, because we've never bothered to do anything about it.
Exactly. And I mean,
you know,
you go to a city like one I'm thinking about is Hamburg on the Rhine.
It's got loads of one-man ferries.
Absolutely.
Amsterdam was the same. There's bits there. You go across the river and they're free.
Ferries just go back and forward. If you go to any city, really, Lisbon's got a great system. Sydney, Brisbane, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, everywhere has got these, and they've also got bridges and tunnels, but you've got a balanced transport system with a ferry. We could easily have half a dozen ferries on the Forth, a dozen on the Clyde, running back and forward, more ferries downriver, and then much more frequent services on places like Arran, Mull.
Smart ticketing as well to join it up with the bus service and the train service. That would be fab.
Sorry, I'm just laughing at that. I mean, I live in Glasgow. We've been trying to get smart ticketing between the buses and the trains for bloody donkey's years, actually.
I live in Clackmannanshire, and see that thing you're saying about frequency, that applies equally to a rural bus service. I mean, our bus is every 2 hours and no service at all on a Sunday.
Well, you know, the river is a great artery, and you could theoretically have passenger vessels going to Bo'ness, up to Clackmannan, up to Alloa. Alloa is accessible you can actually get a vessel up to Stirling. and for tourism, what I found in my studies globally of fast ferry services in urban centres like Sydney, Parramatta and so on, is that half the people that use them are tourists.
Exactly.
Half are commuters. So you get a tremendous revenue from the tourism. And every development every new land development up a river, a university campus, a historic house, a housing estate can be linked into the ferry network. And that's how they did it in Brisbane and also in San Francisco as well to some extent. So all these things are possible, but our institutions are culturally very rail-oriented or road. The engineers are terrible at Scotland. I had a real problem on the Clyde when I was doing my Clyde River bus studies, and I did 2 for Scottish Enterprise and Strathclyde Partnership. The city council, all they wanted to do was build low bridges on the Clyde, which destroyed navigation.
Stop the boats, exactly.
Just destroyed navigation, So they didn't think about the river as a transport artery. And yet you can imagine thousands, millions of people travelling on the Clyde River bus, and I estimated it would have become the number 4 or 5 visitor attraction in Glasgow. Hundreds of thousands of people a year. Because as soon as people see a river bus or a waterfront in a city, that's what they want to do.
The thing that I find really frustrating, I think, is the fact that we've got such a history of shipbuilding in Scotland, especially the Clyde, and the word ferries is shorthand for "and how crap is Scotland?" Alistair Jack managed to shoehorn it into a debate about Section 35.
Does he agree with me that rather than manufacturing constitutional battles, the SNP would be better focusing their energies on fixing the failures across Scotland, not least in health and education?
Well, again, I don't want to bore everyone with a long list, but we could add ferries and many other things to that list.
Which just shows you, the currency it's become.
Well, you know how I like it? I compare it to colonialism. And a lot of my research around the world has been with the great ports around the world. They're all former colonies. Most of them, many of them, Dubai, Malta, Singapore, you name it, even in Australian ports. But a lot of them are former colonies. And the first thing they do on decolonisation is develop their maritime infrastructure.
I never thought, but ferries. I never thought that. But I have now gone, as Fiona, if you've been saying, I've gone, oh, ferries, we could do this, we could do that. There are all sorts of possibilities. So hope you've picked up on some of these ideas as well. Because
it's exciting to hear the ideas from people who actually will make a difference to their lives as well. But isn't it nice to be having a conversation about the possibilities and benefits of what we can do as an independent Scotland? It frees us up to do some of these things. We've been stuck in discussions about process and a vote, but actually, let's not lose sight of the big prize here. It's to have a better Scotland that works better for all of us.
Absolutely.
So let's just thank our guests. So thank you very much for Geordie and Mike. We thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you up in Orkney. And also, as ever, great to have Professor Alf Baird in the studio with us.
Thanks for watching, everyone. And next month, we're going to be carrying on a sort of marine theme. We're going to be talking about free ports, green free ports. What's the difference? And actually, one of the things you and I have been talking about, Fiona, is, Orkney, in the Bronze Age, Orkney was at the centre of shipping lanes. There are some ideas that could perhaps make it back in the centre of shipping lanes.